Back on the Chad Hasty Show, News Talk 95.1 FM, 790 AM KFYO. Joining us on the phones right now, former Special Assistant to President Donald Trump and former Press Secretary to Vice President Mike Pence. It's Marc Lotter. Mark, welcome back to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back, Chad.
Absolutely. Anytime. Let's talk about last night's presidential address, obviously from President Trump in the Oval Office. I thought he did very well last night. What are you hearing this morning from those that watched it, and what did they take away, and what did you take away from last night's speech?
Well, I'll tell you, Chad, I was in the White House on Monday and talking with the president, the vice president, and Secretary Nielsen. And what I heard last night and what the American people heard last night is the same thing I heard him talking about on Monday. And the fact that the Democrats think this is some sort of a manufactured crisis is just impossible to even believe. We know what's going on the border. We know that there are 60,000 people a month the last few months that have been coming across, and it's not like it used to be. It's not like it was in 2012 when 90% of the folks coming across were single adults, mostly male, mostly from Mexico. We now have family units and unaccompanied children by the tens of thousands that are coming. And then when you hear those horrible stories that Doctors Without Borders was saying 1/3 of the women have been sexually assaulted. Yeah. 70% of the men, women, and children have been victims of violence. To say that this is not a humanitarian crisis, it's just laughable, and it's kind of pathetic that's what they believe.
Well, I would like for someone to ask, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, who gave the rebuttal last night, if that's not a crisis, what do you consider a crisis? What would you consider a crisis along the border?
And you are absolutely right. I mean, just let's go back last summer when, they were up in arms and they were filling the airwaves with tear-filled pleas because of the families and the children and separations. And now you've got women being sexually assaulted. You have children and women who are being subjected to violence, let alone all of the drugs that are pouring in and poisoning the rest of our neighborhoods, killing our families and friends and neighbors and coworkers in communities across this country. To not call it a crisis, not recognize what it is, just shows you that they have been completely consumed. And I said it this morning on Twitter, someone needs to tell the U.S. Surgeon General, because we now have 2 confirmed symptoms of Trump derangement syndrome. The first is memory loss, because they obviously can't remember that they used to support border security and a barrier. And the second now is blindness, that they can't actually see that there is a crisis at the border.
Right, and then to call it immoral and all of this, the Democrats, and this is what they do, they play on emotion, and that was the Democrat response last night was emotion, that this is all President Trump's fault, that people aren't people aren't going to be paid come the 15th. They're not going to be paid. They're going to miss paychecks, that the image of America should be the Statue of Liberty, not a 30-foot wall. It's just emotional. There was nothing factual coming across from the Democrat response last night.
Well, and you know what? And here's a message to Senator Schumer. Hey, Chuck, you know what was right next to the Statue of Liberty, which was Ellis Island, where people registered and came through our country legally by coming in and registering and saying that they were coming here. So, yes, you're right. We're all about legal immigration, and the president said it last night that he is for legal immigration. But what's going on right now is not legal. It is not moral. And the fact that they think a wall is immoral, maybe, how would they feel if we start tearing down the fences and walls at federal prisons and just trusting that drones will keep the prisoners in check? That's not how it works.
Visiting with Marc Lotter here on the Chad Hasty Show, there were, I think, 2 or 3 moments last night in the president's address, and I want to get your thoughts on them, that it almost went back to vintage Trump and vintage campaign Trump when the president was talking about the elites who have the walls built around their homes, that the politicians who have the homes, or who have the walls built around their homes. And the president also talking about how this is why the politicians, and I don't have it word for word, but the politicians who don't want to get anything done. It was almost vintage Trump in those two statements.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think the American people saw that. Look, this is a president who has already tried to offer ideas and compromise and accept some Democrat proposals. In fact, they've had some really good ones. The vice president was telling me, and if you go back and look at the letter they put out over the weekend to the Senate leadership about their funding plan and how they plan to spend it, there was an idea in there that the Democrats brought up. They said, why do we not allow the children who are seeking asylum or want to seek asylum from Central America, let them apply for that asylum at our embassies and consulates in their country of origin down in Central America? President, that's a great idea. They can apply down there. If they're approved, they can come to the U.S. If they're not, they can stay home where they currently are. It would require a change in law, and it would require some additional staffing and facilities down there to be able to handle that kind of activity. President, that's a great idea. Let's include that in our proposal, and he did. The Democrats that say that, well, walls are 15th century technology, let's use 21st century technology, are ignoring the fact that the president included $571 million to beef up security through technology and additional personnel at our ports of entry. Yeah. But here's the thing they're not telling you. When we stop more drugs and more trafficking of people and individuals coming into our country through ports of entry, what are those drug dealers and smugglers going to do? They're not going to throw their hands up and say, well, there goes my business. That was a good ride. Right. No, they're going to go look for the next weakest link, and that is an unsecured and porous border, which is why we've got to have that barrier in the places where it makes sense, technology where it makes sense, and additional personnel across the entire line.
Visiting with Marc Lotter here on the Chad Hasty Show. I'm glad that the president took the fight to the American people, and showed his hand last night. I thought that was very good, very smart for the White House to do. What is, obviously the president's going to be traveling down to the border today. What's the next step? Where do we go from here? Obviously 3 weeks now, or a little less than 3 weeks until the State of the Union address. Where do we go from here if you're the president and the White House to get public support on your side and to win this thing?
Well, he's going to be hosting congressional leaders today at the White House. He's going to the Capitol this afternoon to meet with Republicans in the Senate, and then he's off, obviously, to Texas tomorrow to visit the border. I don't have a lot of hope. We saw it last night. It's also something that the staffers told the vice president over the weekend, and you heard Chuck and Nancy say it to the American people. No negotiations unless you completely capitulate and open the government first. They won't even talk negotiations until the government has been reopened, and it's tough to deal with people and negotiate with people who won't negotiate. Right. So, clearly I think the Democrats are going to play the politics of this. They are going to hurt the federal workers and not do anything until the checks don't go out on Friday, so they and their friends in the media can then talk about these federal workers who unfortunately have been stuck in the middle. And they're being used as pawns by the Democrats. They're not going to negotiate until that paycheck is missed. But, the president has said it. He wants to negotiate. He wants a deal. He's willing to make it. But if not, he'll use the power that's invested in him by Congress and in the Constitution. He'll declare a national emergency, and he'll build that barrier himself.
Do you think, and obviously we're a few weeks away from the State of the Union address, do you think this will be solved by the State of the Union address? And if not, do you see the president maybe including that declaration in the State of the Union?
Well, I don't want to get that far ahead. I mean, obviously, I know the president wants to negotiate. He's going to go back at it today with Congress. We'll see what the Democrats come to say. If they say anything that's beyond what they said yesterday, there's not going to be any negotiations until you open the government. Yeah. And that's unfortunate. I hope the federal government workers can get paid again. I want to thank each and every one of them who's listening, who's still doing their job, still on the border, still at our airports, and all of the other places where federal government workers are doing the work, even though they're not getting paid. We know they will be. They will get their back pay, but it doesn't make it any more difficult for some of those families. The administration knows it. But border security, protecting our families from drugs, stopping the gangs, and stopping the humanitarian crisis of what's happening to these migrants is absolutely important. And the president's not going to waver on that.
That's great. Marc Lotter, appreciate your time as always, and we hope to have you on in the near future again.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you. That's Marc Lotter, former special assistant to President Trump, obviously. Still has some connections there. He was in the White House earlier this week, and former press secretary to Vice President Mike Pence.